thanks to all of you who joined us for day one of Sci-Fi. We will be diving right into the first panel of the session. It's a big picture panel, and we'll be talking about the return of the state in cyberspace. I'll be handing over to James Lewis, who will be moderating this panel. Over to you, James.
Thank you, great. And let me quickly just name the panelists. Elena Chernenko, head of the international section of Kommersant. Winston Wenyan Ma, adjunct professor, NYU School of Law. Johanna Weaver, special advisor to Australia's ambassador for cyber affairs. Johanna, congratulations, you have the longest title. Abdul-Hakeem Ajijola, chair, Consultancy Support Services Limited. And Lydia Kostopoulos, strategy and innovation advisor at the U.S. Special Operations Command. So a great panel. Our topic is, of course, the return of the sovereign, and which is a great topic, and the establishment of boundaries in cyberspace. I've asked the panelists to keep their remarks relatively brief, and I'm going to open with some questions. This will be a conversational format. My name, by the way, is Jim Lewis, in case you can't read the bottom of your screen. And I work at a place called CSIS. First of all, can we just go around the room, and can you tell me, we start with an assumption that sovereignty is manifesting itself, and I think we all agree with that the state is playing a larger role for its variety of reasons. Could you give us some idea of how this is happening? What are some concrete manifestations of this expansion of sovereign control into cyberspace? Winston, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I guess that's because the China-U.S. tech war is still ongoing, right? From the tech war, we can see many aspects that the governments are very active, but specifically from the investment side, I can definitely describe, what I see as their direct aggressive activities, both at the individual corporate level as well as the digital infrastructure level. From the at the corporate level, maybe the TikTok situation is the best example, because essentially what the TikTok situation involves is that the U.S. government is using the investment regulation to ask the Chinese company to unwind its U.S. acquisition 2-3 years ago. Because TikTok's U.S. business started with an acquisition in the U.S. and then it developed on that basis. And at the digital infrastructure level, the best example is 5G and a semiconductor. And what I see is both sides are using sovereign investment funds to develop alternative technology, right? On China's side, because semiconductor is one of its main import, so China is using sovereign funds to develop semiconductor technology so that it can be more chip independent. And on the US side, because its technology is behind Huawei 5G, is setting up new sovereign vehicles to develop 5G technologies that can provide alternative solution so that US and the Western countries can use different technologies from Huawei. So in summary, what I see is the governments have become more active in the investment field, either blocking foreign investments or unwind overseas transactions, and using sovereign investment vehicles to develop their own technologies.
Great, thank you. That's a good framing. That's a good framing intro to the discussion, because one thing we hear a lot from Europe is the issue of technological sovereignty. Elena, do you want to pick up the thread? When you think of balkanization, when you think of the role of the sovereign on the internet, how do you see it manifesting itself now in ways that are different?
Well, if you ask from the point of Russia's government, we cannot talk about the return of the sovereignty or the state on the internet, because from Russia's point of view, the state has always been the most important player there in this field, and the governments have always been the most important stakeholder out of this multi-stakeholder model on the internet. So for Russia, it's not the return. The principle of sovereignty has always been the most important one. if you look of all of the initiatives that the Russian government has proposed in this sphere, starting with way back as 2011, the first draft concept of a convention for international cybersecurity, this idea that there is this principle of sovereignty on the internet in cyberspace, it goes all through the whole document like a red line. So that was always the most important idea that Russia was pushing through all of these initiatives. And it has taken steps to ensure sovereignty for itself in cyberspace already starting like 10 years ago at least, starting to create alternative infrastructure for a situation where it could have been cut off the global internet. This process intensified very significantly after 2014, after the events around Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and this big clash with the Western world, where Russia really started drifting kind of away and feeling this confrontation with the West. And not so many years ago, a special law, the sovereign internet, was adopted in Russia. So that's a process that has been taking place for many, many years. And so maybe the Russian government even feels that for everybody else, the state and the sovereign has returned, but for itself, it has always been there.
And the interesting point you brought up is that when we talk about balkanization, I don't like that term, by the way, but it's in the title, so we'll use it.
Fragmentation, maybe.
Yeah, the fragmentation is driven by larger political concerns, and I think that's a crucial point that you've made. So, Lydia, can we turn to you for your views? Yeah.
No worries. What I wanted to say is that I think that in efforts to understand how nation states are exerting their authority, it's important to understand that digital infrastructure, technology infrastructure, is being superimposed on top of sovereign territory. It crosses through national borders, and it is replacing some of the infrastructure that nation states have created for their citizens. So if you think about, for example, in the US Postal Service, this is an infrastructure built by the government to exchange communications. But if you think about how that's been replaced today by Microsoft and Outlook, or by Gmail and Google, you start to see there's like a pattern of different infrastructures that have been replaced by big companies, tech companies. The same thing with healthcare. And so Amazon, Google, and Apple, they're all interested in the healthcare space. And this transcends outside of the US and also eventually into Europe by the end of the decade. And so if you look at the way that Europe and the US have approached it, Europe has started years ago with GDPR, and today they're looking into taxes in terms of saying, because the Google, for example, or Facebook, they're not being taxed in the countries, in all of the European countries. And so what they're trying to say is, if you have customers in our country, we should be able to tax you on that, on those customers that you are making money off of. So this is one way that Europe is trying to exert its authority. And then in the US right now, Congress is talking about breaking up big companies such as Amazon and Google because of the breadth of how big that they have come. And I think that if you look at it in terms of critical infrastructure and how they're taking over different types of services that governments had initially had more control over or offered, then you can see where these concerns come from.
Great, thank you. Abdul-Hakeem, what are your views?
Well, very quickly, I'd just like to observe that I think the first or the early generations of computer emergency response teams were not necessarily government. They actually belonged indeed to academia and, of course, many of the private sector players. But what I'm observing across the world is that there is a generation of computer emergency response teams that are now not only government owned and operated, but actually are embedded in the national security establishment, particularly the intelligence establishment. And many of these newer generation or new iterations of computer emergency response teams, in many cases, actually report directly to the National Security Committee or equivalent, which is chaired by the Chief of State. So in other words, they actually now seem to report directly to whomever is the Chief of State. And again, I think, as Lydia and others have pointed out, there is this evolution. I think I would build on something that Harvard Emeritus Professor Joseph Nye had said, that the weaponization of interdependence. And I think this is specifically something that the US in recent times has been driving. And for me, as an African, I worry that we may be caught out as, unwary victims of some of these interplay. I think Winston had alluded to, the USA-China interplay. You also have the USA-Russia interplay, and indeed now add to that the China-India. So these geopolitical interplays and, frankly, potential cyber warfare battle spaces. How do people like myself advise African governments on how to weave their way around? Because geopolitics now is impacting the technology interests of various nations. And of course, those same nations are now leveraging new tools like fake news, hate speech. They're being weaponized. We've seen mimetic warfare, resulting in the spread of weaponized ideas so that other countries have influence and control internally. And so these are now well-established for state and non-state actors. So these are the challenges, I think, not just for Africa, but for the global South, because as they say, when the two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. And for now, we are the grass.
Great, thank you. I have an elephant joke from Central America, but I'll save it in the interest of time. You've raised an interesting point, though. All of you have touched on the fact that this is being driven largely by the changed political environment. And, one of the thoughts we had when the internet was first commercialized was that it would be a world that shared values, that shared an approach to law. And that's clearly not the case anymore. So there's a strong political element here. I'd like to come back to the technological possibilities. This European notion of technological sovereignty is appealing in many nations. But before we do that, let's let Johanna correct everything I've said that's wrong. So Johanna, over to you.
Not at all, Jim. In fact, I think for me, the term sovereignty in cyberspace is such a loaded term. So often it invokes immediately a positive or negative reaction, whether it be, and going to your point about back in the early days of the internet, you have things like the Barlow Declaration of Independence in cyberspace, where he so lyrically proclaims, "You weary giants of flesh and steel," meaning countries, you have no sovereignty where we gather. And then you compare that with the approach to sovereignty taken by countries like Russia and China. And here I really do agree with what Elena said, that this is not the return of the sovereign. The sovereign has been here throughout, but in different forms. And I think the key thing for me when we're talking about sovereignty in cyberspace is that it's not presented as a binary choice between that libertarian view or between a state-centric view, but that we need to apply more nuance to that conversation. And in particular, that we shouldn't be reinventing the concept as cyber sovereignty, but that we should look at the existing principles and rules that govern sovereignty and look at how that applies in the 21st century. And I think, we have really good basis to be doing that from the 2015 GG reports. And I mentioned that, Jim, because I know it's dear to your heart as the person who perhaps crafted those words. But we have universal agreement that the principles that flow from sovereignty apply to states' use of ICTs. That's important. It's not saying we're reinventing the concept of cyber sovereignty. It's saying we're taking those existing principles. And those existing principles come with many different elements. Obviously, state sovereignty is the foundation of our international system, but you don't have state sovereignty at any cost, at any price. If you like, there is for countries a price of being a participant in the international domain. And that is, for example, that you have to respect international human rights, that there are rules around trade, so you can't use them as technical barriers to trade. So I think this idea of cyber sovereignty as distinct from sovereignty is something that I'd like to see some more nuance in the conversation. And I think it reflects maturity in our conversation, that we are now focusing more on what we mean when we say sovereignty in cyberspace.
Some great points, thank you. I like the idea that it's not a binary choice, because very often, and I'm as guilty as anyone, very often it's presented that way. It's either the sovereign or the laissez-faire approach. I don't know if we're supposed to say this, but I'll say it anyhow. If people are, we have a chat function. I believe if there's a little time, people can submit questions. We'll try and get to them. Of course, we won't get to them all, but the panelists have raised some interesting points. The idea that this is an evolution, the idea that the sovereign has always been there. Although I would say that in the early days, the sovereign was pretty darn invisible in many ways, and that was a conscious decision. That's changed, and there were countries that weren't comfortable with it. But when you think about sovereignty, when you think about how this is going, what would you point to as examples of this going forward? What are the things that countries should do? What are they doing, and what should they do? And again, we'll go down this list again. Winston, do you want to start with that one?
Yes. No, I fully agree with you that the sovereignties are always there, but now they become more obvious and more upfront, right? But the challenge is, at this moment, they don't know what they want. I think that's a huge challenge, not only to the governments, but also to the overall digital economy, the players, and speaking from the perspective of a sovereign investment fund person, right? That's huge uncertainty for investments and transactions. And again, if you use the TikTok situation as an example, right? Both sides want to say there are national security issues. The U.S. side said, TikTok and its parent company ByteDance, you must sell the U.S. business to us because it's national security of the U.S. And from the China side, it says, I need to manage the ownership of the algorithm because it's national security of China, right? And I tell you, as a corporate party in the middle, it's very hard to develop a term sheet that can please both sides, because both sides have different kind of view of what control of data means. And it's especially difficult for the corporate when both sides, China and the U.S. government, seem to suggest they have the final say, right? And to conclude this, I would say it's not only limited to the U.S.-China, because as we speak, EU is socializing the idea to set up its own tech-driven sovereign investment fund to cultivate, quote unquote, Europe's own tech unicorns. So going forward, we can only imagine there will be more situations like TikTok, and more countries, more blocks will be involved. Back to you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a key point. And so TikTok seems like an anomaly. Some of that was because of the way it was handled, which was a bit ad hoc, we could say perhaps. But if you look at the European Union, if you look at China with its new data rules, if you look at India, all the big countries are wrestling with the idea of how do we get control on these third-party apps that in some ways are a challenge to sovereignty. We're using an app that is based in another country that we can't regulate, that we can't control. And so how do you extend this sovereign control? And TikTok is just one of, I'd say, 3 or 4 efforts like that: China, Europe, India.
You're right. You're right, Jim. When you say it's an anomaly, it's just it's kind of a new phenomenon to have these kind of a cross-border app.
Yeah. No, and that's what I think all countries are wrestling with here. It's that you can, the connectivity is global. Connectivity is, with the exception perhaps of China and a few others, difficult to interpose yourself. But so people can download apps from a third country and have very little control. Elena, can we get your views on this one, on particular what how this is going?
Well, Jim, you asked also where what could be done.
Yeah.
I have closely studied over the years of covering Russia's cyber diplomacy efforts, the ideas that the Russian authorities were pushing on the international arena in this field, and this idea of trying to make some universal rules of where sovereignty applies and what governments can or should not do on the internet and on cyberspace and this particular field seems worth discussing to me. Russia has proposed since many years, for example, to discuss the prohibition of interfering in each other's internal affairs using ICTs. Now, after 2016 and what happened with the US election, whatever you might think about who has done that, this point has gotten particular interest in other countries, in Western countries as well, and where, of course, I see clear limitations to where there could be agreement in this field. I think it is worth discussing this. Maybe it could take some confrontational part of this. Vladimir Putin has proposed just as recent as, I think, 2 weeks ago, again to the US government, I think it's already for the second time, to kind of, at least on a bilateral level, to establish some kind of agreement of a non-interference in each other's elections using ICT technologies. There has been no reaction from the US so far, but I think it's worth discussing on global level whether we can see any depoliticized, very, very basic principles that could be all right with all of the countries and could take some of the tensions off in this sphere.
Thank you. Those are crucial points, and I think the part that tends to get left out is it's not just a dispute over the technology, it's a dispute over values. And in some ways, I don't think that's going to be resolved, having done this for a while. I have to say, sorry, Johanna, I'm really glad not to be involved in the UN discussions now. But this comes up repeatedly, this challenge to what we once thought were universal values, and now you have countries saying they're not universal, they're Western. And until we can figure out a mechanism for resolving that. But why don't we hear from Lydia, since you've also got views on this, I know, Lydia. Thank you, Elena.
Yeah, I do think so. I think that there's a range of ways that nation states need to interact with each other. And Jim, you said, what should nation states do? I think what Elena was talking about would be on the conflict side. How can we deal with conflict in this space? How should nations work together in a conflictual environment? But I also think that there's the other side, which is how should nations cooperate in a non-intentionally conflictual way. And an example I'd like to give is the finance industry. So if we could think about how many startups are coming out with their different types of e-currency and how digital payments are becoming more and more common. In Africa, in Asia, and slowly but surely we're going to have more of that in the US. I think that we need to start talking about how we should collaborate and cooperate in this space, how we need to share information in terms of trying to stop crime, but also to facilitate more commerce, not just at the individual level, but also at the corporate level. And so I think that's one example of where nation states should seek to try and get ahead of this instead of try to resolve issues after certain types of e-currencies have gained critical mass.
Great, thank you. Abdul-Hakeem, you brought up the global south, and I think that reflects on both what Lydia and Elena had to say, which is that you have the elephants. I don't feel much like an elephant, but I'll accept it for now. You have the elephants, right? And the Central American metaphor, you have the elephants and the ants, right? And so when the elephants dance, the ants become nervous. And it's not fair to call the global south ants. The global south is powerful. It has a voice. What is it struggling to say in this? What is it that would be a good outcome from your perspective?
Well, let me start by saying what do I think the global south needs to do first and foremost. I think first and foremost the global south needs to moderate and adapt to the realities of a multipolar world of technology, not just multipolar in terms of geopolitics, but actually in terms of technology. And then the question is, how does it do this? Well, frankly, it does this by building proficiency across the board, but especially in things like monitoring and in looking at ways to proactively navigate all of these complex and varied, I don't know, economic, commercial, technology, privacy, connect. I mean, there's a lot of intertwining. And one of, in addition to building these capacities, we also have to find ways as a global south to motivate indigenous research so that we can, develop, innovate. We need to understand, the list goes on and on and on, but it's all about developing our own solutions so that at least we begin to minimize or maybe optimize our currently total dependency. Our dependency is actually the Achilles heel because we depend on these technologies to such an extent, but more importantly, we depend on the value chains, the production chains that produce this. In addition, we need to develop very robust vetting systems, and just a couple of examples. First and foremost, there was a case with a very low cost phone that's been sold widely across Africa, and what has been discovered is that that phone has some embedded malware which cannot be removed because it's been embedded somewhere in the value chain, quote unquote, at the factory level. Now, this malware steals your data and sends it to somewhere. Given that it uses the bandwidth you pay for, and understanding that bandwidth in Africa, for example, is very expensive. So basically what is happening is that you are stealing somebody's data, but the victim, who is already poor, is paying, very high costs for his own data or her own data to be stolen. Now, on the second level, you mentioned that we are using a particular app today for this specific set of conversations. It's interesting that the government of India recently blocked 118 different apps, which it considers prejudicial to its own sovereignty, security, and integrity. Now, should a government opt to ban an unremovable app? And it's not just this app on this cheap phone in Africa. We're talking about things like Siri. Siri is listening to us. That's as good a reason for a sovereign, I think, to want to ban and remove an app. But the question is that doable? Is it possible? Because we have no control over these things. So what we've ended up doing is that our government have still not found a way to disempower foreign entities, especially private foreign entities, in part because they can't exercise control over their own jurisdiction on the internet. So again, I think that this is only going to get worse when we look at how artificial intelligence is taking over back-end processes. Of course, we see a lot of digital espionage across the continent. And all of these things have implications for privacy, for the ethics of the internet. And that also goes to another point. The Global South, the nations in the Global South really need to begin to define their own principles, their own ethics. What are the ethics that undermine their thinking and policies vis-a-vis many of these technologies? And like I said, a responsible government does need to consider the banning of certain platforms and devices that are inimicable. But again, is it doable? Is it possible? And then on a final note, when I look at my children, do they care? Arguably, they just want a quick and dirty solution to whatever is the problem ahead of them. Are we overthinking this? Sorry, I'm not giving a very clear answer, but I'm just trying to bubble up some of the thoughts that, kind of swirl around in my mind. Thank you.
No, I think that was a clear answer, and it helps sort of perhaps set Johanna up, because if I have a number of criticisms, as you know, of the current UN process, but one that would strike me that's relevant to things Winston, Elena, Lydia Abdul-Hakeem have all said is it doesn't look at the technological underpinnings, right, and which are shifting rapidly as we look at cloud and artificial intelligence. And the technology is cross-border, but the approach, certainly in the UN, is very much defined by national sovereignty. How do you see us working that out? I mean, are we going to come up with an agreement that is perhaps, why won't it be irrelevant? And I know that's an easy softball for you, but why is it useful to pursue these agreements that are very much arms control focused, very much focused on sovereignty?
Well, look, I think to start with, we need to dispel with the myth that you can have sovereignty or you can have national security. Just like we have sovereignty and we have national security in the physical world, we can also have sovereignty in the concept of cyberspace while still maintaining national security. Now, of course, we need to put rules and frameworks around that, but again, we don't need to be starting from scratch. And I think Lydia's comments about the perspectives from a trade or an economic perspective. I mean, there are plenty of examples, pre-existing examples, for example, in free trade agreements or WTO arrangements where you have national security policy carve-outs that allow you to do things on an extraordinary circumstances or an exceptional circumstance that you would not otherwise do while still allowing for the free flow of data and goods. So I think there's a lot of precedent there on the economic side. From the security side, again, there is a lot of precedent for this. We have this wonderful thing, the UN Charter, which at its very core recognizes
yours doesn't have any coffee stains on it. What's wrong?
It's pretty dog-eared. But, you know, at its core, it recognizes state sovereignty, but it also recognizes the right of states you still have an inherent right of self-defense, another way of saying national security. So I think this idea that you can choose one or the other is a false choice. It doesn't exist in the physical world, and there are plenty of ways that we can expand that into the conversations we're having in cyberspace. And I think the other conversation, and this is really to pick up on points that everybody has made, is this idea that we have a choice when we're talking about sovereignty in this space between a fragmented cyberspace that is a choice between a US option or a Chinese option or a Russian option. It just is no longer the case. And again, I think partly probably the highlight of our dependence during COVID is really focusing the mind on a larger group of community on this issue. But it really highlights the fact that, as Abdul was saying, this is about how do we, outside of those global powers, how do we develop and foster innovation so that we have an alternative product that is there? What are our values or ethics that we stand for? And how can we as middle power countries, and here, you know, I look throughout the global south, I look to countries like India, to Australia, how can we act together with very clear views on what our values, what our ethics are, so that we can provide a viable alternative in this environment? And to pick up on Elena's point about the offer from Russia and universal rules, well, I think we have universal rules, particularly around the principle of non-intervention. So we agreed in 2013 that international law applied. A fundamental feature of international law is that you should not intervene in the internal affairs of another state. Election is case in point. So in my view, and those rules were negotiated and agreed, including by Russia, and we have had them endorsed by every country in the world. The problem, in my view, is not a lack of rules. The problem is a lack of adherence to those rules and accountability when countries are breaching those rules. And that's very much on the security side, and I really would affirm what Lydia said, that we need to look at this from both perspectives, from the economic and the security side.
Great, thank you. I would have added a third word to your list of reasons why the problems with existing rules, and that is the absence of consequences. And so we need to start using words like response and retaliation.
Yes.
Hopefully a more a more aggressive American regime will be willing to consider some of these ideas more forcefully in the future. That sounds a bit dreadful.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's really what I mean by accountability, is there must be consequences if you breach these rules. And we're starting to see that, for example, the EU sanctions coming out, etc. But it is still a nascent field comparison to the rulemaking in this space.
So we have about a little less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you all to quickly respond to something that I hope captures the points you've all made, which is this idea that we did get a question, which is that, one of the reasons that cyberspace is unstable is states have these agencies, and the agencies are responsible for a lot of the malicious action we see in cyberspace. Can we hope to see efforts to control these actors to build global confidence and to improve stability? I would note that in the past, that whenever such agreements have appeared, whether it's Geneva or the UN Charter, it's always been after a crisis. In fact, in some cases, it's been after a disaster. So we'll just put that in the background. You can bring back to it. But could each of you then, in that context, the need to control agencies, the need to agree on rules, either the existing rules or how to enforce them, or whether we need new rules, what would be a good outcome in this space? Tell me in the 8 minutes we have left, if you could each quickly say, what is a good outcome for the return of the sovereign? And I agree with Elena, the sovereign has always been there, but the sovereign's expanded role, what would be a good outcome as we look here in our final 8 minutes? Winston, we'll start with you again.
Okay, I would say a possible positive outcome is the separation of sovereignty issues and private company and / investment issues, right? At the sovereignty level, you certainly have the data security issue, you have this data localization issue, and also the cybersecurity issues. And in that kind of context, maybe the sovereigns can work together to develop a framework, hopefully not after a disaster. In your word, Jim, right? But to the private context, I think right now we sort of have the common enemy, which is the big tech, right? Around the big tech, you have antitrust issues, you have personal data privacy issues, and then you also have this sort of quasi-national infrastructure regulation issue, right? How do you manage these big tech to make it beneficial to the country's economy, to the personal data protection, as well as the general economic development, right? So I think if we separate the issues into the two categories, sovereign issues and private market issues, we can probably find a balance among the sovereignties, and also develop a good regulatory systems to regulate the big tech. Back to you.
Okay, great, thank you. I just got a note from the organizers. We have 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to go down the list again, but you could perhaps be as brief as possible in answering this extremely complicated question. But Elena, we'll give you the first shot at a 90-second response.
I'll try to be really, really quick. Just reacting to something that Johanna said, I absolutely agree. And of course, there's no point in disputing that the international community agreed that international law applies to cyberspace and to the spheres of this idea of sovereignty and non-interference. But I would welcome a more nuanced discussion on this, maybe a special conference or something, and what are the exact examples of what can be counted as interference or not. Trolls from St. Petersburg meddling into US elections and spreading panic in the US, is that interference? And how about, for example, taking the 2009 so-called Green Revolution in Iran, where the State Department contacted the Twitter management to ask them to postpone their maintenance work that was scheduled for the Iranian segment because there is a revolution going on that the US government was supporting. So is that a kind of interference? I would welcome our governments to sit down and actually discuss what is okay and what is not if the state is behind such acts, as the trolls and as this idea with this example with Iran. So I think we need a longer conference than those 45 minutes minutes that we have here. Sorry for having taken more time.
No, that's okay. I'm always amazed at what we were able to sneak into the 2013 and 2015 agreements. And in some ways it will be hard. I hope we don't recede from that high point in whatever is drafted now. But Lydia,
We won't.
Your views. Yeah.
I would say that as we all need to upskill and learn new things and understand our world differently, our governments also need to do the same thing. And that means that understanding that states are not the only actors and developing a more robust office around technology relations so that it's not happening later where the legal infrastructure has to try and mend something, where there's a constant conversation between government and big tech around how things should be done. So that's what I would say.
That's a great point. I wish we had more time, but we don't. Abdul-Hakeem, please.
Okay. Very quickly, I would love to see more sovereigns embracing the concept of multi-stakeholderism. And within that context, I would love to see those same sovereigns evolve into a point of not only coordination, but a point of aggregation for multiple stakeholders.
Great, and I'm glad you brought up the word multi-stakeholder. It's the first time in a discussion on sovereignty, so crucial. Johanna, you get the last word.
Thank you. I will make 3 very brief responsive points. First, to answer your question is what can states do given that there is very clearly states active in this space, that states have agencies that are often conducting what may be perceived as this malicious activity. And I think the best thing we can do here is encourage countries to be transparent that they have these capabilities, that they are using these capabilities. It is mind-boggling to me that there are still so many countries that, from reading a newspaper, have these capabilities, but still don't disclose the fact that they have those capabilities. And if they're not disclosing it, they're not transparent, then you don't have that framework around them. Australia has disclosed that we have offensive cyber capabilities, but we have committed that we use them in accordance with international law and the norms of responsible behaviour that are agreed at the United Nations. More countries need to do that. Very briefly on Elena's point, very agree with you. I think it will be difficult to get countries to give those very specific, this is interference, this isn't, because you don't want to create a situation where you go right up to that line and then not cross it. But very interested to continue that conversation. And indeed, we published some case studies. It's available on DFAT's website. If you navigate to Cyber Affairs, there are some case studies that are looking at some of those questions. And then finally, just to emphasize the point that both Winston and Lydia made, we really need to upskill our governments. This needs to be a continual conversation to bust this myth that it is national security or sovereignty, and could not agree more that this needs to be a continual conversation with big tech and with the multi-stakeholder community as well.
Great, thank you. I'll summarize very quickly, which is that it's clear that states have a responsibility to their citizens, and they are now acting more assertively to protect them. But this comes in the context of a larger international dispute that is more than simply a great power contest. I do think there's a contest over values to some extent.
Yeah.
And finally, if there's one conclusion you can safely draw from the remarks of our panelists, which I found very valuable, it's that there will be some rebalancing between the state, the sovereign, the private sector, the citizens. And this rebalancing, it's not black and white, as Johanna said. It's going to happen. It's essential. And it's a good opening for the sci-fi panel. Johanna, Elena, Winston, Lydia, Abdul-Hakeem, old friends all, or some new friends, but good to meet you, good to see you, and thank you for doing it.